The morning air at Fort Carson was sharp and dry, the kind that cut through a uniform and left breath hanging in clouds. Frost clung to the red dirt, while a mixed formation of Army trainees and Marine liaisons stood shoulder to shoulder. Boots lined in symmetry, rifles slung tight against their chests. The sound of the range flags snapping in the wind carried across the field, joining the low hum of nerves that filled the space before a long day of joint drills. The talk and laughter quieted when the door of the admin trailer opened and a figure stepped out, walking with an even, unhurried stride. She wore a plain gray windbreaker. No patches. No name tape. No visible rank. Her hair was tied back. Face steady. Clipboard tucked under one arm. Evelyn Monroe, the civilian safety consultant from Quantico, looked like she belonged behind a desk, not on a training range. Staff Sergeant Trent Vance caught sight of her and smirked AG-0, his voice carrying across the line as he said that the paperwork brigade had arrived. The comment hit its mark and drew a wave of quiet chuckles through the formation. Even Lieutenant Brennan grinned, sipping his coffee and not bothering to look up. Evelyn didn't flinch or look embarrassed. She paused at the edge of the range, her eyes moving slowly across the open ground. She studied the field like someone mapping a battlefield. Her gaze shifted from the berms to the wind flags, to the cover points that would matter if things went wrong. The details of elevation, visibility, and firing angles seemed to interest her far more than the jokes. The chill wind pressed against her jacket, outlining her posture, the way she kept her balance slightly forward, weight centered on the balls of her feet. From the back of the line, Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone watched her carefully. Decades of training let him recognize something few others could see. That was not the stance of a civilian. That was the posture of someone who had moved under fire and survived it. Vance leaned toward another instructor, muttering that she probably didn't know which end of an M4 fired the round. The laughter flickered again, but it sounded less certain now. Evelyn made a small note on her clipboard, her writing crisp and deliberate, then turned her head slightly to gauge the wind direction. Her calm drew attention in a way noise never could. The recruits fell quiet, without realizing why. Stone kept watching her, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. He knew combat discipline when he saw it. The stillness, the awareness, the subtle control of space around her, it all spoke of a different world than this training ground. As the sun rose higher, painting the frost gold, Evelyn Monroe remained a mystery, standing in gray against a field of uniforms. Somewhere inside that calm, Stone thought, that was a story no one here was ready to hear. And as the wind moved across the range, a voice in the back of every mind seemed to whisper that appearances can deceive, especially when the quiet ones have already seen war. The day started before sunrise. The cold air rolling down from the mountains and settling over the Fort Carson range. The trainees stood in loose groups, checking rifles and gear. As the instructors prepared the live fire briefing, Evelyn Monroe stood to the side, clipboard in hand, listening carefully as Lieutenant Brennan reviewed the firing sequence. When he called the wind negligible, she raised her voice just enough to carry. She recommended an adjustment in range distance because the crosswind would push left to right across the lanes. Brennan gave a tired smile, then said they trained for unpredictability. Staff Sergeant Trent Vance added that paperwork couldn't stop a bullet. The laughter that followed was short but sharp, echoing across the cold dirt. Evelyn didn't respond. She just wrote something down, her handwriting clean and deliberate. When the range went hot, she stood behind the second chalk line, observing muzzle, discipline, and form. Her notes listed warped M15 blank firing adapters, misaligned set screws, and a trainee with a finger inside the trigger guard while repositioning. She made no scene. No correction allowed. She simply wrote, then moved on to the next lane. When the training ended, the others headed to the mess hall. Evelyn stayed behind, inspecting the BFA bin, tagging the damaged ones with red tape. That evening, the lights in the aid tent glowed faintly as she reorganized the trauma kits. She lined them by sequence of use. Tourniquet first. Gauze second. Hemostatic third. Airway tools last. Doctor. Nina Cross walked in and stopped. Surprised to see her there. She asked why Evelyn was rearranging kits that already passed inspection. Evelyn's answer was soft, almost casual. Seconds save lives. Then she closed the lid and carried the kit back to its rack. Cross watched her go, the thought lingering longer than the sound of her footsteps. At 5 a.m, long before reveille, Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone stood at his window in the barracks. Below, he saw Evelyn running the perimeter road, a 40-pound ruck cinched tight to her frame. No music, no companion, just the rhythm of controlled breath and steady stride. She moved like someone who had done it for years. Not for fitness, but to stay sharp. Stone watched until she vanished into the low fog. By midweek, the jokes about her quiet ways had faded into whispers. Her patience made people nervous. It was easier to deal with someone who argued than with someone who listened. Every smirk and dismissive shrug seemed to slide off her like water, leaving behind something harder to define. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her quarters, the lamplight pooling across her open notebook. She wrote a single line before closing it carefully. Leadership disregard evidente. Then she turned off the light. Hier expression unreadable. And the room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the heater working against the cold. Evelyn Monroe sat in the operations hut with her notes spread across the desk. The hum of the overhead light filling the silence. The report in front of her was precise and clinical. Each defect in the M15 blank firing adapters had been logged with serial numbers, torque values, and photos, stripped threads, missing set screws, warped metal. She wrote that the defects created a risk of gas blowback under live conditions, her tone factual, never dramatic. When she placed the report on Staff Sergeant Trent Vance's desk, he barely looked up from his coffee. He laughed, called it another love letter from the clipboard, and slid it aside until it rested under his mug. Lieutenant Brennan came in a few minutes later, scanned the first page, and handed it back without reading. Training needs friction, he said. Chows builds character. Evelyn nodded once. No reaction on her face. She logged his response in the margin and left quietly. On her way out, she paused by the armory, checking the bin of adapters again. The same bent pieces she had flagged last week were still there. She picked one up, rolled it between her fingers, then set it back down with careful precision. The next morning, the convoy lane exercise began under Brennan's supervision. Dust hung low in the air as trainees prepared to move through the simulated urban course. Evelyn stood near range control, holding her clipboard close. She waited for Brennan to finish his briefing before speaking. Her tone was calm but firm when she noted that the casualty simulation near the blind corner would cause crowding and unsafe crossfire. Brennan dismissed her with a wave, saying they needed pressure, not perfection. Vance grinned, told the recruits that consultants worried too much. The drill started, and chaos followed exactly as she predicted. 2 trainees rounded the same corner from opposite sides, rifles raised, and collided shoulder to shoulder. The barrels crossed, the muzzles too close to one another. Evelyn stepped in before anyone shouted. Her voice cut through the noise, steady and unhurried. One manages fire. One handles the casualty. She made them reset, rotate rolls, and repeat the movement until they cleared the corner smoothly. The order and rhythm she brought to the moment silenced the confusion faster than shouting could. When it was over, Vance clapped sarcastically, calling it range poetry. Evelyn didn't answer. She checked their spacing, made another note, and walked the rest of the course. From a distance, Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone watched her every motion. The way she handled the situation, the way she issued corrections short, clipped, professional. None of it belonged to someone learning procedure. It belonged to someone who had lived it. After dark, the range emptied and the cold set in. Evelyn moved along the firing line with a small flashlight, collecting spent casings from places they shouldn't have landed. She carried them to the safety officer's desk and placed them in a row. "If you find where these came from," she said quietly, "you'll find the habits that lost them." Then she turned and walked back into the darkness, her shadow blending with the range flag swaying in the wind. Behind her, Stone stood in the distance, watching, the unease settling deeper in his chest. He knew now that she wasn't just a consultant. She was something else entirely. The sun was at its highest when the range went hot. The wind shifted left to right across the chalk lines. Just as Evelyn Monroe had warned days before, dust lifted from the red earth, and the rhythmic crack of rifles echoed against the berm. From behind the second chalk line, Evelyn watched carefully. She noted how the trainees passed M15 blank firing adapters between rifles without tracking serials. The torque values she had flagged as weak were now an unseen hazard, buried in the noise of confidence. Private Connor Hayes stood out among the line. Young, focused, eager to prove himself. He ran his second magazine with textbook precision, sight picture steady, breathing measured. The instructors watched with casual pride as brass casings flared into sunlight. Then it happened. A sound that did not belong. A muffled pop. A metallic ping. And the rhythm broke. Evelyn's head snapped toward the fourth lane before anyone processed the change. She was already moving as she shouted "Cease fire" across the range. Her voice cut through the gunfire like a command that came from somewhere deeper than authority. The range froze. Muzzles lifted. Fingers came off triggers. Evelyn was already past the chalk line, boots hammering the dirt. Private Hayes was on the ground, clutching his thigh. Blood was spreading fast through his pant leg. A deep arterial red. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside him, her voice calm but firm. "Cease fire." Range cold. She peeled his hands back, assessing the wound in a glance. Shrapnel had torn into the femoral artery. She reached for the nearest range safety's pouch, pulled a tourniquet, and looped it high and tight on his thigh. One hand braced the strap. The other turned the windlass until his breath hitched. "No pulse distal." Good control. She spoke the assessment aloud as she worked, keeping the trainee conscious. Her movements were surgical. No hesitation. No panic. She checked for airway and breathing, then pressed hemostatic gauze into the wound channel. Her sleeve caught on the concrete edge of the lane, tearing open at the forearm. The wind pressed it back, revealing the eagle, globe, an anchor tattoo, and the black belt insignia etched in clean, faded ink. The range staff stopped in their tracks. Even Vance, who had been halfway through a curse, fell silent. Evelyn grabbed the radio from the nearest safety officer and keyed up range to medical. Priority 1. Male traine, approximately 20 years old. Shrapnel injury from BFA malfunction. Hemorrhage controlled with tourniquet. Time is 2:32 p.m. Request ground medevac to the aid station. She rattled off the grid coordinates cleanly. Every word steady. Every second accounted for. The medevac acknowledged. 4 minutes out, Evelyn nodded once. Already back at work. She checked Connor's pulse again. Spoke to him evenly, keeping his focus. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. "You're going to be fine." He tried to speak, but she cut him off gently. "Save your energy." When the medevac truck arrived, she directed the lift herself. 3, 2, 1, move. They transferred him onto the litter with minimal jostle. "Doctor." Nina Cross jumped out of the vehicle, her eyes going straight to the tourniquet. Perfect placement. Time, Evelyn answered without looking up. 2:32 p.m. The medic nodded and took over. Evelyn stepped back. Hands streaked with dirt and blood. Her expression unreadable. As the litter was loaded and the engine roared to life, she called out to the recruits, standing in stunned silence. Check your equipment. Always check your equipment. Luck doesn't stop bleeding. Discipline does. The words hung in the air long after the medevac disappeared down the dirt road. When the sound faded, the only thing left was the wind and the quiet hum of respect. Every set of eyes on the range turned toward her. But Evelyn didn't meet them. She picked up her clipboard from where it had fallen, brushed off the dust, and began to write again. Her pen steady against the page. The laughter that once followed her was gone, replaced by something heavier. For the first time, every person on that range understood exactly who had been standing among them all along. The medevac dust had barely settled when the command vehicle rolled up the range road. Colonel James Harrington stepped out, his uniform crisp against the wind, the silver oak leaves on his collar catching the sun. The field was frozen in an unnatural silence. Trainees stood at attention, weapons slung, their faces pale and uncertain. The smell of burnt powder hung heavy in the cold air. Near the firing line, Evelyn Monroe stood still, her sleeve torn at the forearm, the Marine emblem inked into her skin visible beneath the dirt. Harrington's gaze followed the quiet until it reached her. At first, there was confusion. The civilian consultant on the safety review list was not supposed to be standing at the front of a halted live-fire range. Then his eyes caught the tattoo, and the confusion faded into recognition. He took a slow breath, memory catching up with him. He had seen that name once before, on a Silver Star citation years ago. A Marine who had pulled 3 wounded men out of a burning convoy near Fallujah. He looked at her again. Really looked, and the disbelief turned into quiet respect. He walked forward until he stood a few feet from her. The wind pressed at their uniforms, carrying the faint rattle of the flag against the pole. Gunnery Sergeant Evelyn E. Monroe, he said, his tone steady. Silver Star. 3 combat tours. Marine Corps, Martial Arts, Program Black Belt Instructor. Retired. The words carried across the field like a slow tide. No one moved. No one spoke. Staff Sergeant Vance lowered his eyes, color draining from his face. Lieutenant Brennan froze where he stood, his jaw tight as the truth settled in. The recruits stared in stunned silence, their laughter from earlier days echoing back at them like a memory they wished they could erase. Harrington took one step closer and brought his hand to his brow in a perfect salute. It was a break in protocol. A full-bird colonel saluting a retired gunnery sergeant, but no one questioned it. Evelyn held his eyes for a moment, then returned the salute with the same precision that had once kept men alive under fire. Her motion was slow, deliberate, without pride or flourish. It was respect, given and received. When their hands dropped, the silence deepened into something almost sacred. Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone stood at parade rest nearby, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with pride. He had suspected the truth, but seeing it confirmed carried its own weight. Harrington turned to face the formation, his voice carrying over the wind. "This range is hers," he said firmly. No one disagreed. Vance's mouth opened, then closed again, the words dying before they could form. Brennan straightened, his face drawn tight, and gave a curt nod. Evelyn did not speak. She stood as she always had, calm, centered, the mountain wind curling around her like an old companion. The recruits watched her with new eyes now, not as an outsider, but as a figure carved from the same discipline they were only beginning to understand. The flag above them snapped once, loud and clear, breaking the quiet. The moment held, then settled into memory. As the colonel stepped back, he gave a final nod. "You taught half this corps what survival means." Gunnery Sergeant. His voice was low, almost reverent. Evelyn's answer came soft. Steady. Then, let's make sure they remember it. The field stayed silent for a long time after that. Under the hard blue Colorado sky, respect finally replaced pride. And every man and woman on that range understood what real leadership looked like. The week after the accident brought a stillness to Fort Carson that no one had felt before. Colonel Harrington spent 3 long days in his office, reviewing every report Evelyn Monroe had submitted. 87 violations filled the files she had documented with precision. Defective Minx blank firing adapters. Expired trauma supplies. Unsecured rifles stacked carelessly by the armory wall. Each entry was backed with serial numbers, timestamps, and photographs. It was impossible to ignore. By the end of the review, Staff Sergeant Trent Vance and Lieutenant Brennan were both suspended pending investigation. Their carelessness had nearly cost a man his life. Command moved quickly after that. A formal directive was issued base-wide. It was titled the Monroe Protocol. The new order required serialized tracking for every adapter and weapon part, with inspection logs reviewed before each live fire event. All safety inspections now included independent oversight and random audits from outside units. Anonymous reporting lines were created, allowing trainees to flag unsafe practices without fear of rank or retaliation. What had once been brushed off as paperwork now became the backbone of discipline. The language of the protocol was firm but fair. Reflecting Evelyn's approach to leadership, the next morning, the trainees stood in perfect formation under the sharp Colorado light. There was no chatter, no laughter, only attention. Evelyn Monroe stood at the front of the range, her sleeve rolled up, the faded Marine emblem visible on her forearm. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke the way she always had. Calm and steady. This protocol is not punishment. She told them, it is protection. Every rule, every inspection, every extra second you spend checking your gear is one more step toward bringing everyone home. Discipline is not about rank or fear. It is respect for life. The words carried across the field without force, but with weight that could not be ignored. From the second row, Private Madison Pierce stepped forward. Her voice wavered, but she held her ground. Ma'am, you saved his life, and we called you Deadweight. Evelyn looked at her for a moment before answering. The job isn't about who gets credit. It's about who comes home. The air around them shifted. It wasn't shame anymore. It was understanding. The first clap came from the back of the formation, then another. Then the whole line joined. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone walked forward, boots crunching over the dirt until he stood beside her. His voice was low but clear. Courage, he said, is doing the right thing when everyone else looks the other way. Evelyn gave a small nod. The recruits straightened, eyes sharp, shoulders back. As the wind picked up, the flags above the range snapped clean in the air. For the first time in months, the base felt different. The arrogance that once ruled it had been replaced by quiet accountability. The Monroe Protocol was more than a set of rules now. It was a standard. And under the wide Colorado sky, discipline had finally found its meaning again. The sun dropped low behind the mountains. As the formation gathered on the Fort Carson parade ground, the sky burned with the last light of day, and the rows of uniforms glowed gold in the setting sun. At the center stood Evelyn Monroe, her hands clasped behind her back, posture straight, eyes steady. Colonel Harrington stepped forward, carrying a polished wooden shadow box wrapped in a Marine Corps flag. Inside were her service stripes, her medals, and a single brass plate engraved with the words, "Real leaders don't seek recognition. They seek results." He held it out, his expression solemn, and when she accepted it, the reflection of the light shimmered across the glass like a quiet salute from the day itself. The recruits who once mocked her stood silent, their faces lined with pride and respect. Master Gunnery Sergeant Victor Stone stood a few steps behind her, his arms folded, watching her with quiet satisfaction. For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to smile a faint, genuine curve that softened her usually composed features. It was the first time anyone on that field had seen her truly at peace. When the ceremony ended, the troops dispersed without the sound of boots or chatter, as if afraid to disturb the stillness she left behind. Later that evening, the base was dark, except for the faint hum of lights in the operations building. Evelyn sat in her office, the shadow box resting on her desk. The phone rang once. Sharp in the quiet, she answered, her tone neutral, until the voice on the other end introduced himself as Major Bradley Vance from Quantico Command. He explained the problem at Camp Pendleton, a string of training deaths, falsified maintenance records, and whispers of command negligence. He needed her to go in quietly, to observe, investigate, and restore control. Evelyn looked at the plaque on her desk, her fingers brushing the brass plate. She said she would take the assignment, but only on one condition. If she found deliberate negligence, she would act without waiting for permission. Major Vance's reply came calm and sure. "That's exactly why I called you." She hung up, sat for a moment longer, and turned to the window. The lights of the base spread across the valley like a constellation on the ground. She reached out, touched the glass of the shadow box once more, and whispered that real leadership is earned in silence. Then she stood, gathered her windbreaker, and stepped out into the cool night. As she crossed under the floodlight by the flagpole, her silhouette moved with calm certainty, not as someone leaving, but returning to duty, to purpose, to the quiet calling that never really ended. A voice settled over the closing scene, soft and reflective. Respect is not given by rank or medal. It is earned in the moments no one sees, in the choices that keep others alive. The wind caught the flag overhead, snapping once in the dark. As Evelyn Monroe disappeared into the night, still leading, still serving, exactly as she always had. Some stories end quietly, not with a salute or ceremony, but with the echo of a lesson that stays long after the sound fades. Gunnery Sergeant Evelyn Monroe's story is one of those. She didn't lead with rank or authority. She led with integrity, courage, and the discipline to do what was right when no one was watching. Real leadership isn't about recognition. It's about responsibility. And the truest heroes are often the ones who serve in silence, keeping others safe through their example. If her story moved you, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support stories that honor veterans and the quiet professionals who still carry that standard forward.